This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 932 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's sleeper episode was probably the worst one of the season. It was a lower scoring week across the league, and that definitely had an impact on the picks. But the picks were bad. Drake May was a good streamer, Romeo Doubs had a good game, and the tight end streamers were actually solid across the board. But there wasn't a whole lot of good. Meanwhile, pretty much every deep sleeper flopped. Matthew Stafford was a huge disappointment. Jordan Whittington didn't run a single route. Christian Watson had a 6% target share. It was a really bad week. I'm hoping it's going to be the worst week of the season. Now, before we go and turn things around this week, look, I know that a lot of you are football fans, but I also know a lot of you are basketball fans too. And the NBA is back. To celebrate, Underdog's offering up boosts on all NBA-only pick'em entries through October 27th. That's on top of the Boosttober promotion that's been running throughout the month. Go check it out. And if you're on the site and you're ready to join, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND when you're signing up. That'll get you a nice deposit bonus. You'll also get access to my rest of season rankings. They're emailed to you after you sign up, deposit, and play. That's on UnderdogFantasy.com or through the Underdog app. And that's promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. As usual, we'll kick things off with players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. And we'll go with the one quarterback that I have in this tier this week. That's Bo Nix. Like I said in the 15 transactions episode this week, Nix gets the Panthers. And the Panthers have been a plus matchup this year. They rank as the second best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. Nix has averaged over 19 points per game over his last three. And that's driven largely by the fact that he's given fantasy managers over 6 points per game this season with his legs. The Broncos have an implied total over 25 points this week. That's something that we're not going to see very often. That should make us feel even more confident about Bo Nix. Running back is kind of tough this week, but I've got a couple of options for you in this tier. I'll stick with that Broncos offense. I'll go with Jaleel McLaughlin. He's only been playing about a quarter of Denver's snaps of late, but this could be a game script that they don't typically see. Carolina is the best matchup for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And get this, Carolina's played 7 games this year. And 4 of those 7 games, we're talking about more than half of their opponents, and 4 of those 7 games, we saw multiple running backs score 10 plus PPR points against them. So backup running backs are consistently putting up decent fantasy days. Maybe this week it's going to be Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin. The Saints have struggled a lot against the run recently. They've seen running backs against them in each of the last 3 weeks rank as top 5 running backs in fantasy scoring. And that's also been the case in 4 of their last 5. That's resulted in New Orleans ranking as the 6th best opponent for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. The Chargers get them this week, so of course you're going to fire up J.K. Dobbins. But there's some chance that we see a little bit of Kamani Vidal too. Vidal saw a week-over-week rise from week 6 to week 7 in snap share, backfield touches, and route participation. The Chargers are currently 7.5-point home favorites. So if this game script favors them, maybe Vidal gets a little bit of a bump in terms of touches. It's not easy to find backs who have locked-in workloads in this tier. But I do think that Vidal can work in deeper formats. You just have to hope that game script goes the way that we think that it will. And then speaking of game script, there's some chance that the Jets face a positive game script this week because they get New England. And they're 7-point favorites. New England's been the 3rd most advantageous matchup for running backs this year, putting Braylon Allen out there as a desperation play. I know his usage has dropped with the coaching changes that we've seen in New York, but the Jets also haven't seen great game scripts with this new coaching staff, or without Robert Saleh, I should say. That could change this week, and that's why Braylon Allen, once again, is kind of a desperation play. Moving on to wide receiver, I know I talked a little bit about Jalen McMillan on the 15 transaction show, but he's still well under that 50% rostered mark. I think he's interesting this week against Atlanta because obviously Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, they're sidelined. And there's Sterling Shepard too. Shepard's technically a deep sleeper, but since we're talking Buccaneers wide receivers right now, let's just address him. I'm not sure how exactly the Bucs are going to deploy these wide receivers, and it's important. It's important to know that information. Because right now, when you look at this trio of wide receivers in Sterling Shepard, Jalen McMillan, and Trey Palmer, all of them are probably going to thrive the most out of the slot. And we've seen that role be really valuable this year. Chris Godwin was basically having a career year. We just don't know exactly who's going to play that role. There might even be a rotation. But after more thinking, I think it might go to Sterling Shepard. And again, this week they get the Falcons. The Falcons have allowed the 4th highest adjusted slot rate in the league, meaning teams are really focusing in on their slot wide receivers when they go up against the Falcons. They're targeting them at a high rate. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's Sterling Shepard this week. It doesn't mean that Jalen McMillan has less upside or wasn't the guy to get off the waiver wire. There's a lot of unknown with McMillan as a prospect, and to me, he was a good prospect. You always want to throw that dart when you're talking waivers. I'm a believer in the talent. All I'm saying here is don't be surprised if Sterling Shepard has a decent outing and is usable too. The only Packers wide receiver who gets a reasonable number of snaps who's available right now in this tier is Dontavian Wicks. All the other wide receivers are now over that 50% mark. Green Bay gets Jacksonville this week, and the Jags secondary is terrible. The whole defense is. But Jacksonville ranks as the easiest opponent for wide receivers by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And teams are averaging 77 more passing yards against the Jags compared to their season-long averages. Wicks essentially split time with Christian Watson last week, and we should expect mostly the same here in Week 8. But even on limited snaps, Wicks had an 18% target share thanks to an absurd targets per route run rate. He has by far the best targets per route run rate of all Packers wide receivers, which is a sign that he's getting open. He's in a good spot this week. Now, Jerry Jeudy didn't have a good game without Amari Cooper last week. It was the Cedric Tillman show. But Jeudy ran a route on 98% of Cleveland's dropbacks. He's going to be running a ton of routes for the Browns, and he's going to be doing it mostly as an outside receiver. He ran about 31% of his routes last week from the slot. That's according to PFF. Well, Baltimore, their opponent this week, that's a team that's been attacked on the outside this year at the 2nd highest rate in football. They've also faced the 2nd highest neutral script pass rate. Teams are throwing the ball against the Ravens. And Jeudy, and this also applies to Cedric Tillman, who I was going to talk about later, but again, I'll just talk about him now. Jeudy and Tillman, they're also getting what could be a quarterback upgrade. I think a lot of us think it will be a quarterback upgrade with Jameis Winston starting. So I think both of those Browns receivers, just on volume alone, work as sleepers. Ricky Pearsall is still under that 50% mark, and Jacob Cowing, he obviously is too. This is another situation where we're going to talk about 2 wide receivers from the same team, because there is some intrigue here. Deebo Samuel has pneumonia, Brandon Ayuk now out for the year. I would imagine that in this matchup against Dallas, a team that's been pretty bad against the run, I would imagine the 49ers are going to go pretty run heavy. But with Deebo likely out and Ayuk definitely out, we're going to see a good number of routes run for both of these rookie wide receivers. And keep in mind, we don't know about Juwan Jennings yet. Pearsall led all 49ers last week in routes run. We should feel good about his usage. But with all these injuries, we're likely going to see Jacob Cowing as well. And Cowing had a really interesting production profile in college. One of his objective comps in the ZAP model spit out Tank Dell. So keep an eye on both of these rookies this week and a matchup that's actually a top 10 one for wide receivers when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And then in that same game on the other side of the ball is Jalen Tolbert. The Cowboys had their bye last week, so we didn't see him play. But since week 1, Tolbert's averaged a route participation rate of 87%. His target share per game rate, it's been respectable. It's been at 16%. There's nothing wrong with that in an offense that ranks 2nd highest in neutral script pass rate. Now, San Francisco's not the best matchup, but his participation in this offense makes Tolbert usable. At tight end, I'm going to go back to Hunter Henry. It's not a terrible matchup against the Jets this week. New York ranks 5th in adjusted tight end target share allowed, meaning teams are forcing it to tight ends at a higher rate than normal when they face the Jets. And as I said earlier this week, Henry's had target shares of 16% and 25% with Drake May under center. So he's an okay play. And then before we get to the deep sleepers, I do want to call out Taysom Hill. There's a chance that he plays this week. And with Derek Carr banged up, that could mean a whole lot of Taysom Hill in the Saints offense. So keep an eye on his injury. We're now on to players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues or our deep sleepers of the week. I'll throw out Jameis Winston to start, even though I doubt many of you need to go in his direction this week, at least in single quarterback formats. Like I said with Judy and Tillman, the Ravens have been thrown on this year, almost more than any other team. And that's resulted in them ranking as the 4th best opponent for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. I hope you don't have to use Jameis Winston, but he is in my top 25 right now. Now at running back, I'm going to go back to Dearness Johnson as long as Travis Etienne is out. This week's spot against the Packers looks a lot better for Johnson than last week's matchup did, because we want negative game scripts for him. That's very possible with the Jags as home underdogs. The Packers have also allowed the 5th highest adjusted target share to running backs. As we know, Johnson is the receiving back without Travis Etienne. He's been running more routes than Tank Bigsby. So if this game script goes south, it's going to become a Dearness Johnson game. Now, I already talked about Cedric Tillman, Sterling Shepard, and Jacob Cowing as 3 deep sleepers from this group. But I have more for you. First off, keep an eye on DK Metcalf's injury. If he doesn't go, we're likely going to see more of Jake Bobo. That's really all I got for him. But there is Tyler Boyd. That's another deep sleeper. This one's a deep cut for sure. But with DeAndre Hopkins now out of Tennessee, there may be more targets funneled Boyd's way. And Detroit is their opponent this week. Not only are the Lions massive favorites, so there could be a negative game script which forces more passing, but Detroit has been by far the worst team this year against slot receivers. And Boyd has run 81% of his routes from the slot this season. So he's a deep target. And then lastly, there's Troy Franklin. He's been playing about 2/3 of Denver's snaps over their last 2. He hit a 25% target share in week 7. Now he gets that great matchup against the Panthers, the one that I've been talking about all episode long. It's actually a low-key great spot for him. Now, I was going to talk about Jatavion Sanders in this section, but with Bryce Young now starting, it's tough to get overly excited. So there's no deep tight end sleeper this week. At defense, though, I talked about Detroit on the 15 Transaction Show. They're now rostered in way too many leagues to say that they're a streamer. If you didn't get them, you could look at the Chargers against the Saints, and then maybe as a deeper play, the Falcons against the Bucks, just considering the Bucks injuries. But it's actually a really, really tough week, probably the worst week so far this season for streaming defenses. Now, as usual, I want to give you a couple of pick'em choices to use over on Underdog. Unfortunately, at the time of this recording, though, we can only really make touchdown picks because of how deep these plays are. We're not talking Justin Jefferson here. So here are my 2 touchdown picks. You ready for this? Sterling Shepard, Tyler Boyd. It feels like it's like 2018 with those picks, but we're doing it. Let's ride with what George Pickens would call our slot merchants. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Tomorrow, we got a mailbag episode in the morning, and just a couple of hours after that, we got another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll talk to you then.